We're just going to give it another couple minutes before we start to allow everyone to enter the room. If you've come in after I spoke, welcome. We'd like you to enter into the chat box your name, your position, and where you're from. That would be really helpful for myself and our speakers today. Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome everybody to today's webinar on understanding racial injustice and its impact on student mental health. This is session 2 in our series. Session 2 is Trauma, Barriers, and Behaviors, the Role of Race. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation, and also the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, housed at La Universidad Central del Caribe. My name is PJ Wanger. I am the school mental health lead to this center and will be facilitating the webinar today. Today we will explore the experiences of trauma among marginalized groups and the behavioral manifestations of trauma you may see among your students, as well as barriers impacting life trajectory and seeking mental health supports. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based practices and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up on the Bitly link provided on the screen. This is the second webinar in this series. The final session will be held August 13th. Please register at the Bitly link seen on the screen. We will also email this link to all participants at the conclusion of this webinar. Following this webinar, you will be asked to complete a brief survey. We value your feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of those surveys. All of the trainings we offer are free of charge, and so it's really important that you fill out that survey. So thank you in advance for your feedback. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint slides in the next couple days. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenters during the Q&A time, which will be directed by our project coordinator, Kati Rivera. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you. Please use the chat feature to answer those questions. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. At the time of this presentation, Eleanor M. McCants-Katz is serving as SAMHSA's Assistant Secretary. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement by the Department of Health or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Now let's begin our webinar. We have 3 presenters with us today. Myself, PJ Wanger. I am the school mental health lead Senior Training Consultation Specialist for the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC. We also have Kimmy Carlos, who I will introduce in a minute, and Sarah Howell, who I will introduce later on in the webinar series. So we start today by just giving you what our objectives for this webinar are. We want to define trauma and examine the various types of trauma that are encountered by our student population. We want to look at how that trauma affects the multiple aspects of our lives. We're going to explore how ethno-racial trauma affects a person of color from a lived experience and also from educational experience. We want to understand the impact of racial injustice on students of color, Hispanic and Latino, and we want to evaluate how ethno-racial trauma affects students' mental health and success in the academic environment. So in order to do that, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of trauma. I'm not going to go into it extensively, but this is SAMHSA's definition of trauma. So it results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects of the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So the key parts are the 3 E's: events, experience, and effects. Trauma is overwhelming for an individual, and their internal resources and produces lasting psychological symptoms. It may be exposure to an experience of an event or a series of events that are frightening or threatening and have lasting effects which are overwhelming and challenge our ability to cope. So there's multiple types of trauma. The multiple types of trauma, next slide please, are here. So we have acute trauma. This is a single traumatic event. Could be a sudden loss, a physical assault, a sexual assault. There is chronic trauma. This is multiple and varied traumatic events. So it could be repeated domestic violence. It could be a car accident with serious repercussions and multiple surgeries and rehabs following. It could be a victim of community violence. So chronic trauma is trauma that just repeatedly keeps happening. Complex trauma is multiple interpersonal traumatic events from a young age. So again, that could be the child who is sexually abused over a long period of time. It could be the child that suffers physical abuse. It could be the child who has community violence repeatedly all around them in their community. And that is complex trauma. Secondary trauma, which we're really not going to get into today, is indirect trauma that's caused by exposure through a firsthand account or a narrative of a traumatic event. So for instance, some people who were not per se involved with Hurricane Sandy or 9/11 have heard those stories so many times that they themselves have incurred some secondary trauma. It's also referred to as compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. But again, we're not going to go into that. And ethno-racial trauma, I am not going to address because our speaker, Sarah Howell, is going to address that later on in her presentation. I do want to review some of the traumatic symptoms that occur as a result of trauma. And you can see I have a picture of a human person there. And it's really important to know that trauma affects every single piece of our body. So biologically, physically, it makes changes in our body. People who live in trauma or a traumatic state or suffer post-traumatic stress disorder have a higher resting pulse rate. They have higher blood pressure. They have greater physical tension, lots of manifestations in our bodies in terms of pains. They are hypervigilant. In terms of brain capacity, and I'm going to show you later on a slide, there is a smaller intracranial volume. The brain is actually smaller, which causes in students some of these things like lower IQ, poor grades, decreased reading ability, an inability to attend. In an aroused state, they can't process information, and they have difficulty expressing themselves verbally. So there's a story about a little girl who's sitting in the classroom, and because her thoughts are so intrusive with the trauma that's happening to her, she's not attending in class, and she keeps getting yelled at by the teacher because she's not paying attention, but she's unable to pay attention. And so again, that trauma is seen in so many things that we display as children. Emotionally ineffective. These are things that we see a lot of in schools. So what we see in that realm is children are fearful, or they're sad, or they have depressive symptoms, or they're angry. And that anger may take the form of non-compliant behavior, unpredictable rages, tantrums, or physical aggressions towards like property. They break things, or they might be aggressive towards other students or the teacher. Severe affective dysregulation. They have trouble regulating their emotions because they're living in a traumatic state all the time. Frequent mood changes. Fearful memories that are encoded in the brain differently than those from non-traumatic memories. So some children will subsequently experience the same physiological and psychological fear reaction when exposed to reminders of the traumatic event. So a child who witnessed a shooting in her neighborhood may become terrified when he or she passes the site of the shooting every time. And sometimes those fearful memories, which are characterized as PTSD, may cause children to have intrusive, frightening thoughts during the day or scary dreams at night. So for instance, that child that I just mentioned is having all those intrusive thoughts and is unable to pay attention. And the fear may result in anxiety. And then we have cognitive changes due to traumatic events. And that's trauma changes a child's cognitions of themselves, perpetrators of the trauma, other people, and the world. They see things differently. They have inaccurate or irrational cognitions, which looks like children blaming themselves. You know, dad beat mom because I wasn't finished my homework when he came home last night, and dad was mad at me, so it was my fault. If they're not blaming themselves, they will see themselves maybe as bad or shameful or otherwise lacking in some way that justifies why bad things happen to them. I must be stupid, and that's why this has happened. And they believe that no one is trustworthy. So these things then cause some interpersonal difficulties. Children who experience trauma often develop changes in their interpersonal relationships. They might withdraw from peers, or they have difficulty enjoying activities because, again, their brains and their bodies are functioning in a different way. And they may begin to affiliate with deviant peers due to feeling different or on the outside, or like nobody can love them because of whatever is going on. So again, it changes their perception of the self and the world. They no longer look at the world as a place for opportunity, hope, safety, wonder, but they look at the world as a place that is scary, unpredictable, not helpful, and has no place for a person like themselves. And so on the next slide, before I turn it over to you, I'm just going to show you, and if you've been to any trainings on trauma, you probably have seen this slide, but it shows the tremendous difference between a regular brain, a brain of a child that's not affected by trauma. I apologize for using that regular brain term, but a brain that is not affected by trauma and a brain that is. And you see the difference. The right brain, the brain on the right, is smaller and has enlarged ventricles and actually has holes in the center of the brain. So it's a shrunken cortex. So if I'm a child and that is my brain, I have really trouble being in the world and learning and being a part of an academic environment when all of these other things are going on. And that's why it's really important to address trauma. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Kimmy Carlos. And I just apologize. Kimmy is the founder of the Urban Mental Alliance, advocating for healthy minds in urban communities. She is the CEO and founder of Kimmy Carlos Motivational Consulting and co-founder and lead facilitator of Sister Wellness Retreats, healing spaces for Black women. Kimmy is also a certified health and wellness coach with the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, a certified instructor for mental health first aid, and a trained anti-racism trainer with the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey. Kimmy is the author of the published book, The Window of Grace, Living in Recovery Through Christian Faith. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kimmy, and she will take it from here.
Thank you so much, PJ. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel once again. I want to give my thanks to the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC, and I want to thank you, especially PJ, for that awesome introduction on trauma, which I think is so important. And Sarah, I want to say it's a pleasure to present alongside of you today. So I want to spend some time over the next 30 minutes talking in terms of racism, trauma, and the lived experience of Black and Brown youth. So PJ did an excellent job of laying out in real plain layman's terms what trauma looks like, where trauma comes from, and how that displays itself in the behaviors of our children. I want to talk about specifically traumas that are born out of systemic racism, what that looks like in lived experience, and then talk about ways that we can kind of shift that so we begin to disrupt trauma in the lives of children of youth. So I think one thing that's really important is trying to reimagine our youth, our Black and Brown youth. And when I say Black and Brown, I'm specifically referring to Black children who are of the African diaspora. So that is regardless of what your nationality is, what your ethnicity is, what your heritage is. If you are of the African diaspora in this country, you're considered Black. And when I say brown children, I'm largely speaking to Latino children. However, that does also include our East Indian children, East Asian children as well. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the next 30 minutes are going to be talking about Black and Brown children with an emphasis on Black children especially. So for normal, healthy adolescents, there's some character building blocks that we need that are really important around building confidence, showing caring, contribution, competence, connection, right? In order for our youth to really be able to grow physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, socially, we need these blocks for our children to grow, right? But what we find often in Black and Brown youth, and especially in Black youth, is that these blocks are either not there or they're impeded somehow, right? And PJ did an awesome job talking about how trauma actually impedes these building blocks to development. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the specific ways that systemic racism actually plays in the trauma that Black youth experience and how it disrupts that healthy development of adolescents in lived experience ways. So I'm not talking biologically, I'm talking about what the day-to-day experience is and how that traumatic experience disrupts a healthy development and a healthy life for youth. So often we find instead of our children actually doing the things that youth typically do, right? Building a social life, going to school, getting that education, learning new relationships, making plans to begin their adult life. Instead, we find our children of color actually fighting to be recognized, fighting to have their humanity recognized, fighting to have their voices heard, fighting for a chance at equity and equality, fighting for an opportunity to live in all the multi-dimensions of their humanity. And that in itself is a disruption to the way that our Black children grow, the way they view the world, and the way they engage with the world. So it's important that we're all on the same page so we understand what systemic racism is. We are in a really fortunate place in history in our country right now. And I know that seems odd to say because 2020 has shown us COVID-19 and all of the inequities and disparities in that, but that has also given us a real opportunity for a social justice reckoning in this country. It's given us an opportunity to have what has been a long outstanding conversation around systemic racism and how that is embedded into the fabric of our country. And so I, for one, am grateful that we are having this conversation. As tragic as it is that this conversation comes out of the tragedy of COVID-19, as well as the tragedy of several high-profile killings of people of color, I'm grateful that we are finally having an authentic, transparent conversation around systemic racism. So I want to just lay the groundwork for what systemic racism is, so that we can see it as an infrastructure, as a system, as opposed to seeing it as individual behaviors. So I'm just going to read this definition out loud. A social structure in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with quote unquote whiteness and disadvantages associated with quote unquote color to endure and adapt over time. Systemic racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. Systemic racism is enforceable by violence, state-sanctioned and otherwise, and there is and always has been grassroots resistance to systemic racism. And this is from the Aspen Institute Roundtable on Community Change. So I want to speak to a couple of parts of this really quickly. So first of all, we'll start from the bottom up, where we say there's always been grassroots resistance to systemic racism. So if you think about that, think about Black Lives Matter, think about how the NAACP started, think about the Black Panthers, who were created to serve Black communities. These are all grassroots organizations, not to mention the myriad of grassroots organizations that white folks are really using their advocacy to build and promote and advocate for equity. Okay, so when we see these grassroots movements, they're not new, but I think we're in a new time in history where we're getting much more momentum around having this conversation, right? When we talk about sanctioned violence against people of color, I want to specifically also talk about anti-Black violence and the way that Black humanity and Black bodies are actually violated often, and that is sanctioned both directly and indirectly in this country, and the impact that has on Black people, and especially the impact that it has on Black children, and how Black children are socialized to believe that they are indeed inferior and that their humanity has little to no value. So this is, again, a system of systemic racism, which is different from what we often see as maybe racist behaviors, bigoted behaviors, behaviors of prejudice or discrimination. Those are born out of systemic racism, but systemic racism itself is actually a system. It's an infrastructure that most of our infrastructures in this country have been built upon. So that's an opportunity to just kind of lay the groundwork. So when you look at the different areas this systemic racism plays out, right, it actually shows societal disparities in wealth, income, our criminal justice system, in our employment system, in housing, healthcare, in education, and political power, right? So if you have policies that are built on the belief of superior and inferior, then those policies are going to play out in all these crucial areas in a community, right? Each community needs to have infrastructures for each one of these areas. And often these areas are built on the belief that there is a superior race and an inferior race. And therefore, we often find what I call strategic oppression in these particular areas. Specifically today, we're talking about education. So I think it's really important to understand how systemic racism plays out in education, the way we engage with Black youth, but also the way Black youth engage with the world, the way Black youth experience the world, the way Black youth perceive and view the world, and then the way Black youth actually behave in classrooms and how that's viewed. So as you can see, it's all tied together. And I'm laying the groundwork for systemic racism so that when we begin to talk about the traumas, you understand with a common definition what we're talking about when we say racism. So we're not talking about individual behaviors, but we're talking about systems that actually support individual behaviors. So I want to talk specifically about the trauma of historical systemic racism and how that plays out. And I thought this picture was powerful. This is a nonprofit in Pennsylvania that does a lot of work around counseling with youth. And again, I applaud this time in history where people are beginning to have real authentic conversations about systemic racism and all the different ways it plays out. So it's important that if we're going to have a conversation around trauma, that we talk about the specific traumas that are born out of systemic racism and how those affect our children. So again, PJ did an excellent job laying down a description of what trauma is. I know that Sarah's going to speak to ethno-trauma, ethno-racial trauma, but I want to talk about, just touch on it as well, transgenerational trauma and racial trauma, because these are the two traumas that affect people of color very differently than how it affects other folks. And often these types of trauma are not recognized, right? So transgenerational trauma, or often called intergenerational trauma, is a psychological theory which suggests that trauma can be transferred in between generations, which PJ laid the groundwork for. After a first generation of survivors experiences trauma, they're able to transfer their trauma to the children and further generations of offspring via complex post-traumatic stress disorder mechanisms. So not only does trauma literally change the biological makeup of a person, but this trauma can be literally passed down through the womb, right? That trauma can be inherited, but also, more importantly, what we see is trauma response behaviors that are passed down. So as an example, often communities that are traumatized have high levels of substance use disorder. And that behavior gets passed down from generation to generation because it's a coping mechanism, right? Also, those who are traumatized typically display violence. That's given. And so what happens is you have generations that continue to grow up in environments of violence, and that continues to get passed down. And of course, that plays into a whole host of other things around interactions with law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and a whole host of other traumas that grow out of that. But then you specifically have racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress, and that's the cumulative effects of racism on an individual's mental and physical health. And for the next couple of slides, I'm going to get into that. It has been linked to feelings of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideations, as well as other physical health issues. The subtle and not so subtle ways in which Black and brown humanity is devalued and delegitimized in a culture of systemic racism and strategic oppression, and the resulting cycles of generational trauma and traumatic behaviors. So I'm going to speak around exactly what some of those experiences are and how that has an impact on our Black and brown youth, and more specifically, our Black youth. So the biggest one that we as people of color engage in often is microaggression. Now, incidentally, microaggression is common in most marginalized communities, right? So it's whether you are a person of color, or if you're a person with access and functional needs, if you are LGBTQ, if you are a woman, if you are of a different faith other than Christianity, because we know Christianity is the dominant faith in this country, right? So oftentimes we find microaggressions in various marginalized communities, but I'm going to speak specifically to microaggressions in Black and brown communities, the different types of microaggressions that people of color deal with literally on a daily basis. And I want to stress that micro in no way means small, but it means continuous, if you think about it that way, okay? So I want to talk specifically about three major microaggressions, and I'm going to jump into these real quick and give an example for each one. So a microassault is the most common and also the most apparent, right? And people refer to it as like old-fashioned racism. So when you look at like racial epithets, right, or abusive derogatory language, when we use dehumanizing language, right? So when we refer to immigrants as illegals, right? They're not illegals, they're human beings who are undocumented, right? But we refer to them as illegals. When we refer to Black people as thugs or as savages, right? When we refer to Black women as dogs, right? When we think about the ways that people use language to literally dehumanize and invalue in their humanity, right? Or devalue their humanity, right? That's considered old-fashioned racism. It's much more overt, right? When you think about things like the Confederate flag and the swastika, right? Which is huge. Literally, the Confederate flag to Black folks in this country, African and African American people in this country, is equivalent to the swastika for the Jew, right? Because the Confederate flag literally represents all of the violence and brutality that went on during the time of enslavement of African and African Americans, right? And incidentally, because language matters and because it's so important, simply using the phrase slave also has a tendency to delegitimize Black humanity, because we were not slaves. We were human beings that were enslaved, right? We were human beings that were literally kidnapped and enslaved and sold like property, right? But also overt behaviors like telling racist jokes and blatantly serving, white customers first, or simply ignoring colors of, customers of color altogether, or telling customers of color that they can't come in, right? What all of these have in common is that this is explicit assault on a person's humanity, on a person's dignity, and sometimes that assault is physical, right? When we see all of these physical, brutal acts that people actually perpetrate against people of color, especially Black people, right? So that's a micro assault. But then we also have what I call a micro insult. And that is where we have kind of like a backhanded way of complimenting somebody. So I'll give you 2 examples that I have encountered on more than one occasion. I remember as a young woman, both when I was in college as well as when I was going for my very first job interview. This was back in the 80s, right? And I had a college counselor actually say to me, Kimmy, you're much smarter than the rest of your kind, right? And then I had a woman who was interviewing me for a job, and incidentally, I did get the job, but in the interview, she said to me, oh, you're so articulate to be a young Black woman, right? So these sound like compliments, but it's actually an insult. It implies that you are the exception as opposed to the norm, right? That most Black people aren't intelligent. Most Black people aren't articulate, right? Or if you hear people give insults around how you present your physical self, right? So often Black women hear micro insults around their hair, right? Oh, well, I like your hair so much better when it's straight, right? Implying that if you're wearing the natural hair that grows out of your head, that somehow that's less than, or it's not good enough, right? So those are micro assaults that we hear. We hear them with our Black and brown immigrant communities as well, right? Oh, you speak English so well, oh, you write so well, right? Implying that that is the exception as opposed to the norm. And then the micro invalidation is another one that we experience constantly, where our experiences and our feelings and our emotions and our behaviors are invalidated, right? Where they are excluded or negated as being important, right? So, and when we say things like, oh, stop being so sensitive, or, it's not always about race, or no, that didn't really happen, right? Oftentimes it tips into forms of gaslighting, right? Telling a person of color that what you feel isn't really real, or what you feel isn't really that big a deal, or what you feel isn't really important, or, right, what you feel is not valid, right? So these are 3 major ways that we suffer trauma. And each individual incident might not be a trauma, but the trauma comes in having to deal with these micro assaults continuously. It becomes a normal part of life, right? A micro assault is walking into a store and having the police called on you because they're afraid that you're going to steal something, or because they believe that you've already stole something, right? So living in that type of fear, right? Because you are literally afraid that you are at any point going to be assaulted, or you're going to be insulted, or you're going to be invalidated in a myriad of ways, is a trauma unto itself, because daily it's a sense of feeling that you are inferior, that you are not valid, and that you are not at the table with the rest of the world. I want to talk quickly about the adultification and criminalization of Black and brown youth, how we often view Black boys, Black girls, and that includes our trans Black boys and girls, our LGBTQ Black boys and girls, how we tend to adultify them, right? We view their behaviors as the behaviors of adults. And so our children in schools are reprimanded as if they're adults. Our children, if they get caught up in the criminal system, are treated as if they're adults. They're tried as if they're adults. Our country has a tendency to expect adult behaviors from Black children, right? Not allowing our Black children to live in all the multi-dimension facets of being a child, not allowing Black children to make mistakes as children do, not giving Black children safe spaces, but expecting them to engage with the world as full-blown adults. And then we criminalize their behavior. So as PJ explained about how we see behaviors that are born out of trauma. And then when we see children behave out of traumatic experiences, we criminalize that. I often think about that young lady, I believe it was in Chicago, who had lost her mother. She had been placed in foster care. So she was traumatized, she was grieving, and she was quote unquote acting out, right? She wasn't doing whatever it was the teacher asked her to do. So the teacher brought in the security guard, which was an off-duty police officer. And this police officer not only verbally assaulted this child, but he literally picked this child up and threw her across the room, right? Imagine the trauma that inflicted on this child, right? Imagine how you have to view a child as an adult to literally pick this child up and throw them across the room, right? So that has a lot to do with the way Black children are adultified. They're considered adults, right? And how their behaviors are criminalized as opposed to potentially looking at them as health crisis, not seeing this child as a whole being, not recognizing all the dimensions of this child, not looking at what this child has literally experienced in their life as a Black child in America. Finally, I want to talk about media representation. I want to speak to this photo that I think is really powerful. I got this photo from a website for a movement called 56 Black Men. It's out of Europe, and it speaks specifically to the way Black men are represented in media. And I want to take it a step further and talk about the way Black folks in general are represented in the media and how that shapes the way people view Black children, okay? So if you look at this picture, it's pretty powerful. Most people would look at this picture with a sense of fear, right? Because if you see a Black man who's not smiling, who's wearing a hoodie, right? Again, we do not allow Black people to be multidimensional, right? So all we see is fear, right? And so one of the reasons I think this picture is so powerful, and the full picture actually has all 56 men, is because they're all Black, most of them are dark skinned, they're wearing a hoodie, but then underneath each picture it gives their name and it gives their livelihood. So we're looking at lawyers, we're looking at men who are in parliament, we're looking at entrepreneurs, we're looking at judges, we're looking at engineers, right? But when you talk about just media representation, all we see is Black men. And in this country, dark-skinned Black men with hoods are considered thugs, are considered savages, are considered criminals, right? That's when people stand in the corner of the elevator. That's when people grab their pocketbooks and cross the street, right? And so it's really important to understand the way the media portrays Black people, which in turn socializes the way people view Black folks, right? And then think of the children who see this and internalize what they must be to the rest of the world. So imagine how terribly terrifying it is to walk around in your Black skin because you know that the world actually views your skin as a weapon. So you are terrified to engage with the world around you because you know, either consciously or unconsciously, that the world views you as some sort of threat, right? And how that affects your sense of being, your sense of dignity, your sense of integrity, right? I also think it's important the way the media does not take into effect how Black folks view the media, right? So if you think about the things that we see on the news and the way Black pain is shown on the news, that's not shown for any other race, right? Perfect example, when we see a Black person that has been murdered, whether it's by law enforcement or anybody else who took it upon themselves, right? We see that played continuously on a reel, on the news, all the time. You see this person being shot, you hear the gunfire, you see this person running away constantly on social media, on cable news, with absolutely no regard for how this makes Black people feel, the trauma that Black people endure every time they hear this, every time they see this. And it also continues to validate that belief that Black humanity is of no value, or that Black humanity is inferior, that you can actually show Black people being murdered on cable TV on a regular basis. And no other race is portrayed that way in the media. And how this shapes the trauma that our youth experience when they see this. I want to talk about how the stressors of racism, discrimination, violence, and poverty affect mental health, how those have a traumatic impact on our youth, right? And I want you to understand that discrimination, violence, and poverty actually are a growth of systemic racism in this country, right? That's not to say that there's violence for other reasons, or poverty for other reasons like capitalism, but all of these are part of systemic racism, are born out of systemic racism to strategically oppress those who are of color. And this is actually an observation by the US Surgeon General. So this is research, is not a personal opinion, right? And how this brings about a different type of trauma that people don't often recognize as being trauma in Black communities. So having said all that, and PJ touched on this, and I'm sure Sarah's going to talk about it too, if you think about these particular traumas that youth have, Black youth have, brown youth have, and then if you think about Black and brown youth that are in urban communities that are impoverished, right? And how that impacts the cognition, the physical health, the emotions, the relationships, the mental health, the behavior, the brain development, right? And if there's no intervention, if there's not empowering, uplifting, affirming strategies to intervene and disrupt this trauma, then all of this is carried into adulthood. And now you're looking at things like mass incarceration, institutionalization, gang warfare, substance use disorder, domestic violence, homelessness, because none of this is addressed in Black children. And if it is addressed, it's addressed from a punitive standpoint as opposed to a health and healing standpoint where you are affirming and empowering this little Black child's life and looking for positive, uplifting solutions, as opposed to actually penalizing this child for a trauma that they had no control over, and also for behavior that they also have no control over, because in response to an adverse traumatic experience that they grew up in. So before I end, I just want to talk about the severity of this. The surge is particularly strong for suicide among teen boys. It's up 14% a year between 2015 and 2017. Suicide rates for teens girls, meanwhile, rose 8% annually, 2000 to 2017. However, suicide deaths among Black girls, and I want you to notice here that it refers to teen boys and teen girls, but when we're talking about Black children, we refer to them as females as opposed to teen girls or teen Black girls, okay? Suicide deaths among Black girls aged 13 to 19 rose 182% between 2001 and 2017, while the rate among Black teen boys rose 60% during the same period. And this is language that I snatched off of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline website. The study also found that methods that Black teens use most often in suicide is much more violent, and that has a lot to do with the violence that Blacks often experience in their communities, as well as the way it's portrayed in the media. So we're talking about crisis levels of trauma in our Black and brown youth, and the way we are engaging this is counterproductive to what those building blocks are that our adolescents need. So in conclusion, one of the things that I think is really important is that in order for us to really look at how we can build empowering, life-affirming, validating strategies, policies, structures, procedures around engaging with Black and Brown children, we need to first address the elephant in the room. We need to look at the way a lot of our policies and behaviors are actually rooted in racism, and that's whether it's conscious or unconscious, direct or indirect, and how we can begin to dismantle those oppressive infrastructures and to begin to build new infrastructures and new strategies. And the way we do that is, one, we first become educated around what being anti-racist means so that we can begin to shift away from systemic racist policies and structures. So I'm going to be sharing my resources. You'll get a PDF copy. There's organizations here, there's websites, there's reading material, there's media. The two websites, Project Home and Forbes magazine, believe it or not, these two are two of the most comprehensive websites I have ever found around anti-racism organizations, reading material, media material. You might not be like me where I am, very loud and boisterous and being a voice for it, but there's so many ways that we can be allies to undo the oppressive structures that bring about the traumas that our youth actually deal with. Again, I want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. Sarah, PJ, I'm going to turn it back to you, and then I'm going to look forward to questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kimmy. Loved your presentation. Our next presenter is Sarah Howe. Sarah is a school social worker of Los Americos Newcomer School in the Houston Independent School District. Sarah has built her career working with immigrants and refugees and specializes in trauma and torture survivors within those populations. Additionally, Sarah is passionate about educating others about trauma and trauma-informed education. Sarah is an advocate for the immigrant and refugee community as well as mental health services for youth. Sarah has written 2 chapters about refugee trauma and school-based interventions for immigrant and refugee youth, published in spring of 2019. Sarah, welcome, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm a little bit intimidated to go after that, Kimmy. Thank you. That was incredible. I think I kind of want to start out by just acknowledging that I realize there's this irony in this white woman presenting on the impact of racial injustice on the students of color. I've worked my entire career with immigrant families, and it has presented its own challenges. This is not my lived experience. This is very much my experience working with clients and lots of academic background. But I do realize that I am a white woman giving an outsider's perspective on communities of color. Also, to echo some of the things Kimmy said, one of my roles is with Houston Revision, where I work with at-risk youth involved in the juvenile justice system. And I have one white family. Everybody else is mostly boys, a few girls that are, I thought I was going in to focus on immigrant kids, and I ended up working largely with the African-American community. And it is so insanely disproportionate. It is just jaw-dropping. But from a firsthand social work side, all of my clients, the one white family, I am constantly told to go take care of your people, Sarah. It is unequal, beyond belief. So with that said, I'm going to talk about the Hispanic and Latino community. That has been my focus for the last couple of years, although I will say I entered the field because of working with East African refugees, and that's where I thought I was headed until the surge of Central American minors. So learning Spanish and working with the Hispanic Latino kiddos has been a new skill set in the last 5 years. And head to the first one, I think it's really important when we're talking about the Hispanic and Latino community to have a few definitions because words matter. So Hispanic refers to a Spanish-speaking person living in the US, especially one of Latin American descent. And Latino means a person who was born or lives in South America, Central America, or Mexico, or originally in the United States whose family is originally from those areas. And Latinx is not included in here, but I think I had to look it up a little while ago to make sure I was using it correctly. It's a person of Latin American origin. It's in place of saying Latino, Latina. It's just a gender neutral non-binary term. To give you some context, 18.1% of the current US population identifies as Hispanic or Latino. 57 million people. But of this population, only 33.5% are foreign born. And that's the reoccurrent theme throughout my portion of this, is that so often I focus on the newcomer side, and the point of arriving in the United States does play a big part in how an individual's experience. But please note that only a third of this community was born someplace else other than the US. And so this is American-born kiddos, families that are being treated this way or experiencing racial trauma. So, along those lines, to give you a little idea of the diversity, I think it's so important. I'm from Texas, and I constantly hear everyone who speaks Spanish must be Mexican, and it drives me nuts. Yes, there's a huge Mexican population, 62%, as in from the 2017 census. But I, for instance, specialize in the Central American community. That's Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And like Guatemalans don't necessarily speak Spanish. They speak all these other Mayan languages. The assumption that, and there's a lot of tension between the communities at times, and as among other factors of when you've arrived and whatnot. But the assumption that if you're from another country, if you speak Spanish, if you're Hispanic, you must be Latino you must be Mexican is not correct. And each of these communities has their own within group differences and different cultures, different everything. So next one. That is a good segue to looking at the diversity and unique needs. I pulled from a couple different resources and kind of tried to reflect on my own experience on what's so important to understand about the community in order to work effectively and have a better sense of their experience. There is the historical and social subgroup differences that are going to impact. So this is the country you're coming from, the community within the country. So for instance, if you're coming from Guatemala, are you coming from the Ladino community that identifies as a direct descendant of the Spanish colonization, or are you working with the indigenous Mayan community who has their own experience with incredible systemic racism and persecution over the years? So that is also going to impact why you've come to the United States. And I'm working with I work with a community I call forced migrants that have come for no other reason. The reason they have come is to survive. They have fled because they could not survive in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador. But looking at their experiences and understanding what their experience was in Guatemala along the route, and then how it feels to live in the United States with that history, with those parallels, ethno-racial trauma. But knowing the historical and social subgroup may impact their needs and how they immigrated here. Their time in the United States, newcomer, first generation is tricky because it can mean you're the first generation that was born here or the first generation you arrived in the United States. And when I say newcomer, I'm thinking new families, kiddos that have just arrived, second generation, etc. But really impacts your identity, your connection to your heritage, and how you internalize the systemic racism and just the messages on the news. I mean, nothing we're hearing from this administration at the moment is supportive of our Black and Brown families. And I know that the message I hear my kids come into school with is just, I'm not accepted, I'm not welcome, nobody wants me in my home country or here. Mix of statuses within the family is really, really important. Go back one for me for just a second. This is something I wasn't aware of when I started my role. I didn't understand the concept of mixed status, but knowing that you might have a family who has been in the United States for many, many years. For mom and dad, Theo comes and he was from Mexico, he was from Colombia, he just immigrated. And so maybe he came with a work visa, maybe he came, visas are a little different at this moment, but you might have kids born here, mom's undocumented, someone who came with status and it's expired. You have this whole mix, and so different people are at risk. It's kind of impacts social class, it impacts access to resources we'll talk about later, but it's really, really, you could have all these different immigration needs within one family unit, and how you're going to interact with society, how you're going to interact and how safe you're going to feel in the community will depend on your security and being in the United States. likewise level of acculturation, including your level of language. Your language, if you immigrated here, if your mom did, if you've been in a very insular community where you're living with all other, Mexican American families, if you have just arrived from Honduras and you're trying to make your way on your own, you'll have a different experience. As well as when I see, let's see, Guatemalan families that have had no formal education back in Guatemala, children are arriving in the United States, they're trying to figure out how to be Guatemalan, Latino, new arrivals, living in the middle of Texas is just a big difference. And then family history and personality. Personality here is more like temperament, but I mean, is your family very, very close? Are they, how willing are they to integrate some different North American expectations? 2 minutes. So, and this goes a little deeper into immigration, but the legal status issue in and of itself, that different people in the family might have different immigration statuses, but also, does that mean that there's a threat of deportation? This is super important. And I tried to pull up an article right before I started. I cannot find it. They did research out of the Children at Risk in Houston, Texas, had done some research last year that shared even families who are not mixed status, who are born in the United States, no question of documentation, felt more fear, and the children couldn't separate out whether or not they were at risk for deportation, or the fear that a family member could be deported even though they had status was felt by children in schools. So even if the threat isn't real, the idea that there are officials looking to deport people who look like you, also, colleagues, kiddos in schools, people in a workplace may, hopefully don't know your immigration status, but still there's bullying, there's just discrimination based on, you speak Spanish, you must obviously be undocumented and don't belong here. Same thing with the family separation due to immigration. It can look like a family member being deported, or more often what I work with is kids who've come on their own or are joining a family member who's been here for many years. But that experience of, we're talking about ACEs and about trauma, attachment is ginormous, and just the sense of how immigration, how being a Latino kiddo who is building that family experience and doesn't have the same, has a different experience than other colleagues and doesn't have the resources, the family resources to return for stability. Issues of loss and trauma during the immigration process, and there's unique traumas between pre-migration, during migration, post-migration, traumatic incidences, and loss of status in the community due to loss of self-esteem due to immigration status. Sounds a bit repetitive. But it's all of these complex layers, and I think the big point to take away is people have immigrated for multiple reasons, but often it's because of systemic racism in the home country, and they arrive in the United States to meet a different level, a systemic racism that they were not accustomed to or did not predict, and it catches people off guard. So the idea of ethno-racial trauma is huge. It is something I was not educated on, and there's the citation here, it's in the end, is a phenomenal article that really breaks it down beautifully. That is, ethno-racial trauma is individual and or collective psychological distress after experiencing discrimination, threats to harm, violence, and intimidation. Ethno-racial trauma could also be present at children and youth that, or could be present in children and youth that witness discrimination or violence to others, including their parents or siblings. So I think this really, it speaks to many communities, all Black and brown communities. I think it really, really encompasses the experience of forced migrants and Latinos who are headed to arriving in the United States or first or second generation. In order, trying to think about how best to, so I found a new resource last night, and so I have all this other research I'm trying to blend in with what I'm sharing with you, that I want to make sure I'm giving the good whole picture. When I'm thinking about ethno-racial trauma, it's really important to understand, like I mentioned earlier, the temperament, the personality, the personal identity, the individual, what an individual is bringing in their own experience mixed with the group identity. So their apartment complex community, their wider, you know, the school community, but looking at like the Guatemalan community in the region, and then the Latino experience wider. So there's the group identity, then, but it's important to also look at the collective group history. The collective group history helps inform protective factors, including ways to transmit the acquired immunities, the knowledge, the successful ways that individual and ancestors have learned to navigate life's challenges. But you can't have a good understanding of ethno-racial trauma or working with a client if you don't take into consideration all of these three components: the personal identity, the group identity, and the collective group history. With that, looking at what kind of impact this has on families, on kiddos, I'm focused on kids in particular, but I'm being reminded constantly that work with kids, they goes home to the stability in the household. And so trying to really incorporate the parent need and the parent experience as well, or the guardian, better said. Common health disorders among Latinos are generalized anxiety, depressive, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance use disorders. It's important to know the high rate of suicide attempts, also a ton of self-harm, and a lot of, I see a huge amount of self-harm in the Latino community without, we can talk about lots of different cultural barriers to seeking treatment and like kind of cultural aspects, but this is a community both in country, in Central America, I see, as well as in the United States, lots and lots of self-harm, feeling all of the things we're talking about, not knowing how to express them or having an appropriate area to express, and so a lot of self-harming. Latino community shows similar susceptibility to mental illness as a general population. However, disparities in access to treatment means that kiddos, families are not getting it. The barriers are tremendous. So I don't think, I speak a lot about the cultural stigma around mental health treatment, but it's also finding appropriate trauma-informed, culturally informed bicultural therapists, or just service providers, period. Latinos are less likely to seek mental health treatment for the trauma that has been discussed, but it's also understanding that group collective history and making sure that somebody, what I see frequently, a clinician that says, well, my family is from Mexico, I speak Spanish, and so I get it. I can serve the community effectively. It's being aware of each different culture and that collective group identity as well, not just the language. Next one. The experience of the community. Often groups are grouped under the immigrant umbrella, even if it's a multi-generational family, multi-generations of a family in the United States, they're still perceived as other. So you might have been here, you might have been born and raised here, your parents might have been. I have a good friend who every time we talk, he identifies a little differently. His grandparents immigrated. In some conversations, he says, oh, I am Mexican, I am Hispanic, I'm Mexican American. And the next conversation, he's like, what are you talking about? I am born and raised here. I am as American as you can be. So it's this constant trying to figure out exactly where you fit and how you want to be perceived. And it seems to kind of vary depending on the situation. But it's often other than the dominant culture and different cultural needs. The impact of skin color and less European phenotypic features often leads to greater discrimination. This is so huge, and I found a phenomenal model that I wish I had found time to insert here, but it talks about even within Central America, or even within Latin American society, there's a caste system, there's an order. So I work a lot with the Garifuna community, this Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Latino community, and they are bottom of the bottom within my Latino communities. Incredible discrimination. Right above them, is the indigenous Mayan community or Aztec community, depending who you're, what part of the country or how far back people trace. But the impact of skin color, if you look more Indian, if there's across all Black and brown family or communities, the sense of the lighter skin, the different privilege. I was finding some painful quotes talking about, oh, you're in Spanish, how lovely you look, your baby was born with such light skin, how beautiful she's he's just white. And it has an impact within families, within what my families have experienced back in home country and then arriving here. The stereotypes and discrimination around legal status and illegality, and the idea of crime migration as well. And so all of these lead to, increased marginalization, disproportionate rate of school disciplinary actions and arrests, fewer resources, fewer culturally and linguistically appropriate resources, and larger gaps in achievement, high rates of school dropouts. I have a hard time at times proving why, gaining support, because everybody in the school that I work with is seeking asylum. And so there's the concept of, you don't belong here. Why do you need resources? The question I constantly get is, who in the world funds the school you work at for newcomers? The sense of worthiness because you're the other community. Next. So, and this builds on further, barriers experienced by Hispanic and Latino students are like lack of access to resources in general in high immigrant and high, in the community that I work in. I'm in Southwest Houston, and there are just fewer mental health clinics. There's fewer social services. There's just fewer access to resources in general, lack of culturally appropriate resources, whether that means language or my families don't eat peanut butter and jam. Finding beans and rice is, whether we have the appropriate resources at hand. Lack of linguistically appropriate resources. This also means having resources that for families who do not have a high level of language, period, being able to use a lot of visuals, making sure we're reaching just what we need. Depending on status, whether resources exist or safe resources exist, especially in the time of public charge, and the concern about immigration enforcement and using COVID-19 and testing has been a big challenge. The stigma around accessing help and support, and then the systemic and structural barriers that set a tone of unwelcome and making help inaccessible or limited. I hear a lot about, yeah, but will the doctor want to help me? Will the clinician listen? Can I share what's really bothering me? And how can I sit down with a doctor that doesn't reflect what I look like? The last, or to the very end here, Hispanic and Latino children may experience higher anxiety, depressive symptoms, post-traumatic stress symptoms, and higher externalizing behavior. So this goes back to earlier talking about a lot of self-harm. There's also a tremendous amount of frustration without the vocabulary to either the English vocabulary or just not having I don't have the vocabulary to express all the different ways I feel at times. So higher externalized behaviors, I think, often stem from a frustration and having effective ways to express and an access to express. People are going to hear you fairly. So some of these things in the classroom, go one more, can look like ADHD, an inability to sit still, fidgeting. I get a constant, what really stuck out to me this last school year was, so my school is 100% newcomer. And we're talking newest to the new, just across the border, just arrived in the United States. When I started at the school, I very incorrectly thought that we were diverse. And so we were not going to need to talk about tolerance, diversity. And I thought that teachers who were going to be hired there were well informed of, they were coming because I loved working with diverse populations. Thank goodness we're having the conversations we are now. I'm trying to bring in a lot more around bias and implicit bias. When I looked at who we had, it's a fight to have newcomers referred for special education. But when I looked at who the teachers had referred, they had referred every single Garifuna student, every single one. We only had 5, all 5. And one other very dark-skinned student was referred for special needs. It's not accurate. It is, I'm trying not to say bad words on here. It is ridiculous, but it's the sense of there's all of these, the community, the Garifuna speaking community that I've worked with does behaviors are a little more externalized. There is a lot more fidgeting. My kiddos are out of their seat. They've also had even less schooling than some of the other groups, but it is ADD or anxiety. It is not, it's anxiety more than anything else, but they are definitely referred at a higher rate. There is an intense level of fear, which also is another reason people are fidgeting, moving around, anxious, hard to calm down, angry, irritable. There's a fear of going to school, being separated from your caregiver again. What's going to happen to your caregiver while you're at school? Fear of utilizing resources, fear of law enforcement. And I've had a handful of families over the years who, especially if they're on ankle monitors from immigration, they cut off their ankle monitors and they're in hiding. And so they are constantly changing their hair color. Really, really, how do you know me? What do you know about me? Frightened of being deported, of being lumped into you're Hispanic, so you don't belong here. Irritability, withdrawing, lack of motivation, helplessness, futility, a lot of like si Dios quiere mentality that is a cultural, might be appropriate on the cultural side or something that we learn to work with from a different culture, but how to engage that in a school. And it's not necessarily depression, it's just a different lens. And then externalized behaviors that are, I know my observations being treated a little differently with fighting, self-harm, oppositional, defiant, angry. We've all heard of like the angry Latina, the angry Black woman. That is an inappropriate stereotype. It's like trying to go a stronger word than that. I see a lot of trying to blend in or separate from the dominant or minority culture and seeking support and kinship. So I have a 504, I don't know if it's 500, this is a graphic. Each of my Central American kids, I have never seen such incredible pride in home country, in the country they fled, but trying to find identity, which in time, unfortunately, ends up being sometimes gang support in fellow peers from the country, but trying to figure out where they fit in, where they're not being judged, where they're not being marginalized, where they're not being discriminated against. So that's just a few of the aspects that this might pop up. This is, I will say, a little bit different topic for me to present on, and so thank you for your patience as I stumble through some of it, but I'm glad, as it's a timely, it's very timely, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to share some of the insights from the school.
Hello, everyone. So thank you, Kimmy and Sarah, for presenting on such insightful and, like you said, Sarah, very timely topics, especially during this time in our social climate. At this time, I wanted to invite all participants to please send your questions. Any questions that you have for our presenters, you can either send it through using the Q&A feature, or you can send them in the chat box. I have a couple of questions in the meantime while we wait for some questions that came up as Kimmy, you were presenting, and it's on the topic of microaggressions. You had mentioned, an example that, oh, you speak English so well, and I'm sure that other communities can relate as well, or people who hear, oh, you speak English so well, you don't have an accent. So in terms of, something that's concrete and practical, how do we redirect that conversation? And in terms of children, how do we have that maybe difficult or uncomfortable conversation just to clarify and maybe like redirect the attention elsewhere, but also address it, so that way, maybe the person did or didn't know, and of course may have intentionally or unintentionally, because the intent may not be there, but how do we have that conversation?
Right, that's an excellent question. I just did a presentation this morning with the Ewing Public Schools, and that exact same question came up when we talked about microaggressions, right? Because you're right, often people aren't conscious of the microaggression, right? They don't often even realize that what they said may have been, offensive or inappropriate, right? And so one of the things I always really stress upon is that we want to be gentle when we correct people, but we do want to correct them, right? Especially if it's somebody who is engaging this way with a child, right? So you might want to gently say to them, yes, You know, all of our children are very articulate. Yes, all of our children are very smart. Normalize the fact that, you know, yes, this child is smart. They should be smart, right? And then maybe have a conversation on the side with them and say, I just want to give you some feedback on that comment and why it's important for us to reframe that when we have this conversation, right? So we don't want to humiliate people. We want to gently redirect it, normalize the conversation, right? And say, well, yes, all of our children are very intelligent, or yes, our children do speak very articulate, or yes, they've learned how to actually learn a second language, right? And how brilliant is that of this child, right? So you redirect it so it becomes a normal, positive conversation, but you should always double back and have a conversation with the person so that they understand where the offense may have been, right? Because if you don't, the person's never going to realize that this may have been incorrect, right? Like I grew up for years believing that redskin was not a bad word. It was a part of the football team, right? And it wasn't until I took anti-racism training that I realized how incredibly offensive that is. And that is literally a micro assault on somebody's humanity, right? But if I hadn't been taught that, if someone hadn't told me that, I would have never known. So we want to redirect it in a positive way, but then we definitely want to make sure we're educating as well.
Yes, thank you. And you bring up a good point is, you know, the adding to that dehumanization, if you don't address it right away, then it might become something that's normative, something that's common, and empowering the children to be able to voice that for themselves, right? And also as educators, because I know we have educators joining us here today and people in the allied and related professions in the education system. So we also have another question that came in, and it's for either you or Sarah or Kimmy. It says, how are schools responding to these issues when presented by families, therapists, or other individuals when noticing some of these microaggressions, systemic racism, and unfair assumptions to behaviors? How do you feel schools are addressing this very important topic?
I'll definitely direct that to Sarah.
So I've been trying to okay, I describe myself as not a traditional school social worker, and we're definitely not a traditional school. I used to back up just a little bit. Like there's all sorts of important character education things that schools want kids to learn at different social emotional levels, right? My goal is empowering students and being proud of who they are. And so I want them to know how to ask for help, feel comfortable asking for help in different places. And so I am trying really hard to teach self-worth. And we absolutely address the person or where the comment has come from. I try to take more the approach of the strength space of what we can handle, and talking to kids about that's not who you are, or this is, you know, be proud of, especially, I keep bringing up the Guatemalan side, but I have really ended up focusing on both Guatemalan and Garifuna communities because they are marginalized here in the United States so much within my own school. And so from their side, I come in talking about defining your strengths, I look a lot on self-esteem and talk about, you know, again, the control wheel, what we can and cannot control. And I will address it from the teacher, from the staff, and from other students who are saying things that we absolutely do not tolerate: discrimination, racism, bullying, any of it. But a lot of mine focuses on be strong in who you are and be proud of who you are. And like even this last year, this is my first summer I'm not in Guatemala in Central America, but I've started to bring in a lot more things that represent different cultures and communities so they can find it, identify it, and be proud of it and use it to represent. I don't know how other schools are handling it, except it's just not, the message is it's not tolerated, but I know that it still happens.
So Katya, I just want to add to that conversation that I think as schools begin to understand that we really, as educators in schools and providers, have to recognize our own trauma as well as our own prejudices and misconceptions about these populations. So I think that the schools need to be doing some more trainings. And I do see schools doing book clubs. And in fact, one of the local schools is reading one of the books that is on Kimmy's list and discussing it and really delving into those issues. But I think for educators, we have to know where we are first to be able to correct the behaviors that are happening in school towards the students. So again, we have to know what our own traumas are and what our own triggers are and how our own responses are before we can do trauma-informed care with students. We also need to know what our own prejudices and our own, things that we might say that might be a microaggression that we don't recognize. So I think that education needs to be on both sides.
Right, and if I could just recommend 2 books, if I'd have thought about it beforehand, I'd have put it in my slide, but there's 2 books that really speak to trauma, and especially trauma that starts in youth, right, and then how that displays itself. So one is The Body Keeps the Score, which is kind of heavy and intense, so you want to really spend some time reading that one, and then the other one is The Deepest Well, which specifically speaks to ACEs, right? But both of these books are so awesome. I am not a clinician, I'm not a social worker, but I do a lot of work around mental health advocacy, and so I really try to learn as much as I can around what traumatic behaviors look like so that I can help kind of reframe the way people engage with people of color who have suffered traumas. And so these 2 books were phenomenal, and they're for lay folks, right? So you don't have to be a clinician to read it. And it really gives you a good idea of what those traumas are, how those traumas come about, what traumatic behaviors are, and how it affects the body, right? Physically, mentally, emotionally. So 2 really good resources there in addition to the ones I put on my slide.
I have heard about, and I'm trying to use the scale of ethnocultural empathy. I can only find an abbreviated version online, but it touches on some of these topics as well, of how it's a self-reflective tool just to kind of check in where you're at. And when I'm looking at something that I think that I misunderstood, especially when I went through graduate school, was I thought working with refugees, I was culturally competent, and I was so wrong. I didn't understand. I had no inside out privilege. I just didn't get it. And so I think when you're talking about trainings, we need to go above and beyond. We talk about having cultural trainings, and we're looking, it's not there. I mean, we need to be talking about bias and implicit bias, and really digging into the communities that we're serving, which is a lot more than just being able to name off where our students are from or what part of town our students are from, but really we do, like, for instance, on my campus, I try to do a scavenger hunt or a community tour, but getting a different, digging in on getting it, and like book studies, sorts of things. But it's also about participating and being vulnerable in the trainings, because I'm seeing a lot of trainings offered and people don't listen. And so it's being willing to, open up and chime in.
Yes, absolutely. Part of that learning process is that sometimes the information presented could be challenging to our own, our own internal biases and what we have internalized throughout our lives. And that's also a process within itself, right? I have another question here from another participant. She says she currently works in a predominantly suburban school district. Do you have other resources for staff development regarding the students? What resources would you suggest? So specifically staff and students.
Resources around trauma or racism, or is there specific resources?
No, it's not specified. So let's just for purposes of time, let's say for trauma.
This one I pulled up when you were talking is my favorite. I think we're going to do a book study on my campus. I'll type out the title of it. It is listed, it talks about in utero through age 5, and my task, I did it with interns last year, is trying to have teachers think about, if this is what's happening at a younger age in trauma, how do you think that's manifesting with our 9-year-olds, with our 12-year-olds? It's written by an EDD, and it is phenomenal. I love The Body Keeps Score. I think it's technical. I'm impressed if you really liked it and got through it, because it took me a while to get through as a clinician. It's great, but it is it's technical. But anything that here's a second one actually, Reaching and Teaching Children Who Hurt, and it focuses more on family violence, but it has strategies on every page. And I can give you the title. I can type up both of those.
Sarah, that's great to please put those in the chat, but also participants, please look at the MHTTC websites. There is a lot of trainings going on right now about trauma, trauma-informed care in schools, social injustices. So please, go to the mhttnetwork.org and look at the trainings that are being offered if you want additional trainings in those areas and topics.
Okay. Thank you, PJ. Yes, I will be sending out links to those resources at the conclusion of this webinar. We also have another question here. How are schools responding to these issues when presented by families, therapists, and or other individuals when noticing some of these microaggressions, systemic racism, and unfair assumptions to behaviors? What has been your experience, Kimmy, Sarah?
I don't especially work in the school system, so I can't speak to how schools might be addressing it, but I can definitely speak to the experience of parents. And there's a lot of frustration and fear and apprehension around addressing the traumas and the injustices that students experience in school, because often parents feel like they're not going to be heard and their child isn't going to be heard. And so in my nonprofit, I've had to do a lot of work around teaching self-advocacy and empowering parents to have the vocabulary and the knowledge to be able to go into the door and demand that their voices be heard at the table, right? Because unfortunately, our communities of color are not taught self-advocacy, we're taught service. We're taught to be in service. We're taught to be in a service mindset. So we don't really learn a lot about self-advocacy. And so what happens is it becomes a vicious cycle, right? The parents don't know how to advocate for their children, and then the children learn that this is just the way it is and I just have to accept this, right? So there's a lot of apprehension and fear there. So I do a lot of training around, quote unquote, bringing your voice to the table, how to self-advocate. And the best way to advocate is to be knowledgeable, to have that vocabulary. And that's a big part of it. So when you work from the ground up, meaning you do the grassroots work to empower the parents so that they can advocate for their child, I think that's going to go a long way in changing cultures in schools, right? So it needs to be from the top down, but it needs to be from the bottom up too. Parents have to be able to advocate because there is a lot of frustration there. And as I always share with people, I am a safe person. What that means is that people can come to me with their concerns around mental health or social justice, and there's no judgment, and I keep everything in confidentiality. And people know me as a safe person in the community. So I have so many people that come to me with injustices and oftentimes don't even realize that it's an injustice. They just know that they feel uncomfortable with it, or they're not getting what they need, not even understanding the grave injustice that's been levied towards them, right? And so I find myself often coaching people and teaching people around what advocacy looks like. And we've actually built an entire workshop around self-advocacy so that parents can address it when they see this, because it's important that we don't just rely on infrastructures to make change. If the infrastructure feels that it's been working, it's not going to make change. But when people can advocate for themselves and say, listen, this is an injustice to me, my family, my child, and these are the changes I want, then we begin to see change, right? It all goes back to that grassroots movement.
Wait, I like this question, and I'm going to give you the honest answer, not the school answer. I'm often the mediator, I think, because I'm the touchy-feely one, right? Who fields all those frustrated, sad, angry parents. Schools react defensively. It's embarrassing for a principal to find out that there are allegations that a teacher has either not solved a problem or engaged in something that's offensive or hurtful. And I hear my principal say in the very beginning every year that she is here to defend teachers. And while you want to have a boss that supports you, I don't know what that says about how it's supporting the parents and the community and the kids. So the first instinct on my campus is that they'll investigate. And I have had, there was an incident with a teacher last year who was who stepped back. I mean, he was not removed. I think it was a mutual decision that he moved on, but it was, things are investigated, but very defensively and professionally on the outside, but on the back. And it's an embarrassment that, you know, the school's being appropriately called out. And as I walk the line between the community and the other organization I'm with. I'm in the community, but I have this liaison with, kind of role with the schools, and parents don't understand all of the factors necessarily that are happening in each decision in each moment, but that doesn't, in a school setting, but that doesn't give permission for inappropriate or hurtful or just plain wrong, any of the microaggressions you're describing. So they are happening. Sometimes they're addressed. The school's defensive.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. And then I have one final question here. How would you create for educators as well as the parents and of course the children in school a more inclusive environment and increase their sense of belonging so that way they don't feel like the other, even if they come from a disadvantaged background or other types of marginalized populations, given our current social climate? What's your suggestion on how to create that inclusivity and that greater sense of belonging?
Yeah, like I said, I think we are very fortunate to be living in this time in history, because this is the first time I think ever that we've really had an authentic conversation around the injustices in this country and how it has infected generations of people of color, right? And so I think that now's the time for us to start looking at how we can learn, because it's a three-pronged approach, right? You can't fight a dragon that you don't understand. So in order for you to really understand diversity and equity, you have to first look at what's hindering diversity and equity, and that is systemic racism. So it always starts with learning what anti-racism is, not just non-racism, but anti-racism. Anti-racism means, undoing oppressive infrastructures and systems and behaviors, like you spoke to, Sarah, where the school gets offensive as opposed to looking at, okay, what's not working, right? And that's a normal human behavior, but that just continues to perpetuate the oppression. So we have to first start with looking at where these oppressive infrastructures born out of systemic racism. And then the next thing I think is really important is we have to listen to voices of color. We have to really be able to listen, because if you listen to people long enough, they will tell you why they're in pain and they will tell you what they need, right? But people of color have been taught directly and indirectly, we've been socialized to just shut down because we expect our voices aren't going to be heard. So we need people who are going to listen to voices of color. I mean, really listen, get out of our way and listen to what's being said. And then we need people who are going to be allies to amplify those voices and make sure those voices are at the table. And that's going to mean people who are not of color taking a step back, which I know is difficult when you're used to living in that privilege, taking a step back and saying, I want my students of color, my peers of color, my colleagues of color to have their voice at the table. Not to get into politics, but I thought it was a really classy move when Amy Klobuchar said, I'm taking myself out of the race because it's about time we have women of color's voices at the table. That is how you amplify voices of color. That's how you make change, is bringing everybody to the table, authentically at the table, and making sure that their voices are heard while simultaneously working to dismantle those systems that have oppressed those voices. And that's both for your colleagues, your peers, as well as your students and their families.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Kimmy, Sarah, and PJ for joining us and for providing us with much relevant and useful information regarding this very important topic. I'm going to thank everyone who joined us today and respecting everyone's time. We went a little bit over time. Like I mentioned before, we will be sending everyone a link to our evaluation. We will send a link to the presenter slides, audio recording, and a certificate of completion. And we also will include a link to our third session in this series. And again, I just wanted to say thank you, and I hope you will join us.
Thank you for the opportunity. This was wonderful.
Thank you.